Hello everybody, my name is Annie Ricker and I'm going to talk to you today about the Patriarchy of Genesis and its resourceful, deceitful women. By this point in time, it should come as no surprise to hear that the Hebrew Scriptures were written in a patriarchal society. Genesis is certainly a product of its cultural context, and the narratives that it features bear the marks of patriarchy. Genesis is the biblical origin story. It answers the questions of how God created the universe, the world, and humanity, and it tells the story of how God's people, the Israelites, came to be. These are narratives that still have merit, and they are still worth being told and explored, but entering these stories requires that we enter a world that is not our own. Whatever the gender dynamics of our contemporary American society may be today, they are nothing like the imbalanced reality of life for women and men of the Genesis world. Susan Niditch offers this caution. Genesis portrays a people whose women do not appear to exercise power in the public realm, but who hold considerable power in the private realm of household and children. Theirs is a world different and a different way of imagining and ordering reality from our own. In approaching this material with special interest in passages pertaining to women and gender, one must ask, whose stories are these? So whose stories are these? As we enter the origin story of the people whose God is called the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we must understand that the women we encounter are largely traveling through narratives that are not their own. They are supporting characters in the stories about their husbands, fathers, and sons, in much the same way that they were supporting characters in the reality of their patriarchal society. As we enter the Genesis world, we must remember that women we meet had little to no control over their lives. They had no power outside of their homes and families, and even that power was mitigated by the desires of men. Even their most basic bodily functions were used to marginalize them, as their monthly menstruations rendered them unclean. In the Genesis world, women gained agency or power only through a few precarious circumstances. They gained agency through childbirth and motherhood, and they could gain power through sexual contact with men. And as you'll see, in a world with so few options for them, the women of Genesis gained power and agency through deception. Lies, deception, trickery. Certainly we modern hearers of the text find these things abhorrent and shameful. Our inclination is almost always to venerate the virtue of honesty. But if we are truly being honest with ourselves in our reading of Genesis, we'll find that honesty is a luxury of the privileged. Susan Niditch affirms the resourcefulness of deception, writing, "One of the ways marginals confront those in power and achieve their goals is through deception or trickery. The improvement in their status may only be temporary, for to be a trickster is to be of unstable status, to be involved in transformation and change." The women that we meet in Genesis are absolutely marginalized. They are powerless and voiceless. Through trickery and deception, they have a chance to gain some measure of control over their own existence, even if it is only for a moment. In some instances, like the story of Sarai and Abram, it's the men who require the women to be deceptive. Abraham required Sarai to pretend to be his sister rather than his wife, so that Abraham would benefit from her relationship with the Pharaoh. And in that story, the deception is absolutely beneficial to Abraham as he gets wealthy, and it's beneficial for Sarai by extension. But it is far more common for the women in the Genesis narrative to choose deception or trickery on their own. It is Rebekah's idea, for instance, for Jacob to trick his father into giving him Esau's inheritance. Rebekah is the one who authors the plan and ensures that Jacob is able to carry it off successfully. And yet, though her deception pays off for her beloved son, it's unclear if Rebekah herself benefits from the deception at all. Then take Rachel, one of Jacob's wives. Both her husband and her own father are tricksters who have used deception to get their own way. Perhaps Rachel comes by her trickery naturally, but even in the narrative telling of her act of deception, there is another mark of her marginalization. Jacob is obviously the main character in the story, and so the author pays special attention to Jacob's motivations and thoughts. Laban, Rachel's father, is also discussed at length, and his trickery is given reasons and motivation, though he is a comparatively minor character. Rachel, though, is hardly given any attention, even though it is her action that is the driving force behind the entire portion of the narrative. Rachel steals her father Laban's household idols, though we are given no explanation for her motive in taking them. When Laban is searching for them, Rachel feigns ignorance about their location, though she has actually hidden them in the saddle upon which she is sitting. And to avoid getting up so that her father might search there, she claims that she is menstruating, and so he abandons his efforts. What we see in Rachel's story is that she transformed her cultural weakness of menstruation into a strength precisely through deception. But at the same time, the way that the story is told reinforces how necessary it was for these women to engage in deceit. Esther Fuchs notes, the difference between the literary representation of Rachel on the one hand and of her male counterparts on the other suggests that gender is a sorely overlooked factor in what has come to be known as biblical poetics. The irreducible differences between the temporary gaps, typifying male deception, and the permanent gaps, the relentless ambiguity and the lack of closure typical of female deception, are indicative of patriarchal conception of femaleness. So the very nature of the text itself is to minimize and trivialize these women. Women were insignificant in the Genesis world, so their stories reflect the ambivalence through which they were seen. And finally, we encounter Tamar, who was denied what even the patriarchal Genesis God had asserted was her right. Through her deceptive sexual encounter with her father-in-law, Judah, Tamar was able to secure the one legitimate source of power available to her, children. And rather than be condemned for her deceitful act, Tamar is viewed as righteous. As Rachel Adelman affirms, these stories are part of a larger Genesis paradigm in which the female trickster gains the upper hand against her male counterpart, who otherwise seems to hold a position of greater power. The Genesis world necessitated the dishonesty of these women, but what is perhaps more significant is the absence of censure or condemnation for them, both from their society and from God. The patriarchal society may have disregarded and silenced them, but even in that powerlessness, God affirms their worth and their right to agency, even when it is gained through lies and tricks and deception. And that is good news.